In 1868, the St. Augustine Orphanage, nestled at the edge of the small Alabama town, became a place of whispered rumors and hushed voices. Official reports stated the deaths of 48 children within a year, each casualty marked by fever, starvation, or sudden unexplained weakness. The cause was said to be an outbreak of a rare disease, one that left no witnesses and no answers. But as the bodies piled up and the town grew uneasy, something more sinister began to seep from behind the orphanage's walls. The cries of the children went unheard, their lives easily dismissed as the inevitable outcome of their broken circumstances. The local church, with its towering spire that seemed to touch the heavens, stood in firm defense of the orphanage, shielding it from the encroaching questions of the townsfolk. When whispers of abuse surfaced, the powerful men in the town, those whose wealth and influence were built upon the good works of such institutions, quickly silenced them with a simple, stern hand. Those who dared speak out found their voices lost, their accusations smothered beneath the weight of religious authority and social order. Samuel Thompson, a local investigator with a keen eye for detail, began to piece together a puzzle that no one else cared to solve. He started with the children's bodies, or rather their absence. The authorities claimed the bodies had been hastily buried on the orphanage grounds, a common practice for those with no family, no one to mourn them. But when Samuel began to search the land, something didn't feel right. No headstones marked the children's graves, no evidence of the shallow pits where they should have been laid to rest. It was as if they had simply vanished, taken from the world and erased from memory. His suspicions grew when he met with Father Gregory, the head of the orphanage, a man whose face was perpetually pale, his eyes shrouded with an unnatural calm. Gregory spoke of the deaths with a strange detachment, his tone almost clinical, as though he were recounting a series of facts, not lives lost. Samuel pressed for more information, but Gregory's responses were always the same, vague, non-committal, and wrapped in a blanket of charity. "God's will," he would say. "We are merely vessels for His work." It was then that Samuel began to notice the subtle signs of something far darker at play. The eyes of the children, those few who remained, were too dull, too empty. The smiles they wore were thin and fragile, barely clinging to their faces as if they were too weary to even pretend. A child named Clara, no older than 7, looked at Samuel one day with an expression that chilled him to the bone. Her lips quivered, as if she wanted to say something, but the words would not come. Instead, she pulled him into a corner, her small fingers tugging at the hem of his coat. "They watch us," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The shadows. They take us when it's quiet." Samuel's heart skipped a beat as he saw the unmistakable fear in her eyes. The more he dug, the more the air grew thick with a quiet dread, an oppressive weight that told him something monstrous was unfolding within those high stone walls. The orphanage wasn't just hiding the bodies of its lost children. It was hiding the truth. And that truth, Samuel was beginning to realize, was far more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. Something far darker had taken root in St. Augustine, and its tendrils were reaching deeper into the fabric of the town than anyone dared to acknowledge. Behind the veil of charity, behind the facade of innocence, something evil was being nurtured. The truth, Samuel feared, would not come easily, but in his gut he felt it. The shadows that had been whispered about were very real, and they were not content to stay hidden for much longer. Samuel's steps grew heavier as he ventured deeper into the mystery of St. Augustine Orphanage. The more he investigated, the more the town clung to its silence. Whispers stopped as soon as he entered the room, eyes quickly averting, doors shutting softly behind him. The townsfolk, whether out of fear or complicity, wouldn't speak. They had all learned the cost of curiosity, a life built on the safety of ignoring what shouldn't be questioned. As he stood outside the orphanage's iron gates, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the stone walls weren't just holding the building together, but something darker, something alive, pulsing within. The orphanage itself seemed to breathe with a presence he couldn't identify, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The long, echoing hallways were lined with portraits of saints, but Samuel's eyes were drawn to the walls, where faint symbols had been scratched into the stone. He ran his fingers over them, tracing the lines, an odd blend of religious iconography and abstract shapes, like warnings, like pleas. There were crescents, spirals, and patterns that circled back on themselves as though they were drawing him deeper into something he couldn't yet understand. And there, hidden in the shadows of the main hallway, were what appeared to be marks on the floor. Dark smears that seemed to form a path leading toward a room at the end of the corridor. His instincts urged him to follow it, but something held him back. A feeling, unsettling and cold, crept up his spine. Samuel turned the corner, his heart pounding, and found a small, forgotten chapel tucked in the farthest corner of the building. Its doors were cracked open, a dim light spilling out. As he entered, the air grew heavier still, as though the room itself had been suffocating under the weight of years of neglect. The pews sat empty, but on the altar, carved deeply into the wood, was another symbol, this one much larger, a spiral with a single word beneath it, purification. It was written in a dark stain, one that did not resemble any ink Samuel had seen before. The word gnawed at him. What did it mean? And why had it been placed there so prominently? The chapel seemed too empty, too cold, as if it had been abandoned for longer than the orphanage had existed. Samuel's mind raced. There was no time for indecision now. The children had died, their lives stolen away, and their bodies were nowhere to be found. No graves, no memorials, no acknowledgement, just a hollow absence where the truth should have been. He had expected a clue, but what he found left him with a deeper question. The markings on the walls, the strange cryptic symbols on now the blood-stained word in the chapel, all of it felt like a puzzle he wasn't meant to solve. He backed away from the altar slowly, his mind spinning. The more he uncovered, the more distant the answers seemed, as though they were slipping out of his reach with each passing day. In the orphanage, something had been carved into the very foundation, a darkness rooted deep in the building's bones. Yet as he left the chapel, no one stopped him. No one came to explain the secrets etched into the stone. No one dared. The building seemed to mock him, its silence louder than any words could be. And Samuel knew one thing for certain. The truth was being buried piece by piece in the very walls of St. Augustine, but for how long could the ghosts in the walls remain hidden? Walter Tams had always been a quiet man, his presence more felt than heard. As the orphanage's caretaker, he worked tirelessly, maintaining the creaking windows, the dark hallways, and the overgrown gardens that stretched like tangled fingers from the old building. His weathered hands had touched every inch of the orphanage, but his eyes, those tired, sorrowful eyes, held secrets. Samuel had noticed him first from a distance, lingering near the rear of the property, watching from the shadows as the children played or, more often, sat silently. Walter never joined them, never spoke to them unless absolutely necessary. His work was simple, repetitive. An old man with an old job, caring for the old building. But Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that Walter knew more than he let on. Over time, Samuel had found small ways to start conversations, gentle questions that didn't seem too intrusive. But Walter would always respond with simple nods or vague remarks, offering no real answers. Samuel knew that the man was hiding something, and slowly the unease that had been building in his chest began to shift into suspicion. One rainy evening, as the orphanage settled into its quiet rhythm, Samuel decided to press. He found Walter alone in the garden, bent over a stone bench, his hands gripping the edge as though the weight of the world rested there. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, and the only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Samuel approached, keeping his tone casual. "There's a lot that people say about this place, Walter. I wonder if you've ever heard any of it." Walter didn't look up, but his shoulders stiffened. The silence stretched for several moments before he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "They say a lot, Mr. Thompson, but not everything's true." Samuel took a step closer, watching the old man carefully. "What if some of it is?" he asked. Walter's hand trembled as he stood up, his eyes dark with fear. "Some things should stay buried." There was a pause before he finally met Samuel's gaze, and in that moment, the weight of years of secrets seemed to fall upon him. "You're looking for something, aren't you?" Samuel's heart raced. "I'm looking for the truth." Walter's lips quivered as if he were fighting against some inner force. "You don't understand. There are things you don't want to know, things that shouldn't be brought to light. Not now, not ever." Samuel's patience was thin, but he kept his voice steady. "What happened to those children, Walter? The ones who died?" Walter's face tightened, and for the first time Samuel saw a flicker of emotion. Not just sadness, but fear, deep and unyielding. "It wasn't just sickness. It wasn't just fate," Walter murmured, his voice so low it was almost drowned by the wind. "They were chosen, all of them, chosen for the purification." Samuel leaned in, his mind racing with questions. "Purification," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Walter nodded, his face pale. "It was Father Gregory's idea. He believed the children were vessels, dirty vessels that needed to be cleansed. They didn't just die. They were—" Walter's words faltered, as if speaking them aloud made them real in a way he hadn't wanted. "They were experimented on, purified in ways no one could imagine." The world around Samuel seemed to spin as the full weight of Walter's confession hit him. His mind flashed with images of the strange symbols, the ritualistic markings, the word purification. Walter seemed to shrink beneath the pressure of his words, as if he were a man desperate to flee his own memories. He used electrical shock therapy. He put the children through things that made them scream and beg. He thought he was saving them, cleansing them of their impurities, but it wasn't just sickness, Mr. Thompson. It was the way he thought God wanted it. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. "The bodies. The ones that died. Where are they?" Walter closed his eyes, the guilt consuming him. Buried beneath the walls, not in the cemetery, not in the ground where they should rest. They were hidden, as if they had never existed. The ones who survived, they were left broken, their minds and bodies scarred. And the others, they were purified until they were nothing but husks. Samuel took a step back, his legs weak. The horror of what he was hearing settled into the pit of his stomach like poison. The orphanage, the town, had been built on lies. Samuel knew this wasn't just about a few deaths. It was about something far darker. Walter's words, his confession, had peeled back the veil on an evil far greater than Samuel had imagined. And yet, as he stood there, the old man's eyes pleaded with him to stop. "Please," Walter whispered, "don't dig any deeper. It's too late. You'll never get the truth. They'll never let you." But Samuel, already lost in the horror of what he had uncovered, knew that he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the real story was just beginning to take shape. The orphanage's secrets were buried deep, but Samuel Thompson was going to uncover them no matter the cost. Samuel had spent countless hours sifting through the archives of St. Augustine Orphanage, his eyes skimming over dusty ledgers and forgotten papers. It was late one evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, casting long shadows through the orphanage's cracked windows, that he found it. A faded photograph, yellowed with age and creased at the edges. The image showed a group of children standing in front of the orphanage, their faces bright with youth, a stark contrast to the chilling emptiness he had seen in their successors. A handful of them were dressed in ragged clothes, others in tattered shoes, but one detail stood out: their eyes. In several of the children's portraits, their eyes had been crudely crossed out with black ink. The strokes were heavy, uneven, almost frantic. Samuel's heart thudded in his chest as he stared at the image, the symbols of erasure too deliberate to ignore. Who would mark out their eyes? And why? He didn't know it yet, but this photograph would lead him closer to the heart of the mystery than anything else he had uncovered. The back of the photo had a name scrawled in a delicate hand: Eliza Foster, 1859. Samuel knew her only from vague rumors. She was one of the original caretakers at the orphanage, a woman who had left the institution long before the deaths had begun to spiral out of control. She lived now in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, a reclusive figure who rarely spoke to anyone. The townsfolk treated her as little more than a relic, someone who had witnessed the beginning of the orphanage's secrets but had never been brave enough to speak them aloud. Samuel knew he had to meet her. The cottage smelled of lavender and dust when he entered, the air thick with the scent of forgotten years. Eliza sat by the fire, her frail hands knitting with a kind of calm that only age could bring. Her hair, once a rich brown, was now a pale gray, and her face was a map of sorrow. Samuel introduced himself, and she nodded politely, but the moment the photograph was shown to her, her eyes darkened, her hands trembling as she reached for it. "This is impossible," she whispered, more to herself than to Samuel. She ran her finger over the ink marks, her voice cracking. "They were all so full of life, and before. I remember the day it was taken, though I wish I didn't. They were still so innocent then, but those eyes, Samuel, those eyes, they were never meant to be seen again." Her words hung in the air like a terrible omen, and Samuel pressed her gently, urging her to continue. Eliza looked at him, her gaze distant, as though she had to summon courage from somewhere deep within. "The children in that photo," she began slowly, her voice trembling. "Most of them were taken into the doctor's office. Father Gregory had a doctor, though no one ever knew his name. It was a room no one was ever allowed to enter. Even I, the caretaker, had my orders to keep away. But sometimes I'd hear the children screaming from inside. The doctor was experimenting, you see. He had some twisted idea that the children had impurities, that they were not pure enough to live the way they were. He used the office to purify them. He claimed to make them better." She paused, her hands knotting the yarn in her lap tighter. "But some didn't come out, and the others, the ones who lived, they were never the same again." A deep, suffocating silence settled between them as Samuel's mind raced. The doctor's office, the place where so many children had died or been changed forever. His gut twisted with the grim realization that the deaths were not mere accidents or the result of sickness. They were something else entirely. The children hadn't simply died, they had been sacrificed, altered, torn apart in ways no one should have to imagine. And the eyes, those crossed-out eyes, now made sense. The photographs were their final silent rebellion against the fate that had been forced upon them. Samuel's voice was tight, nearly lost beneath the weight of Eliza's confession. How many children disappeared into that room? How many were never seen again? Eliza's voice faltered as she swallowed hard. "More than I can bear to remember. More than you'll ever know, Samuel. And the worst part is no one cared. Not really. Father Gregory had the town in his pocket, and the doctor, Well, he was just a part of it all. People who could have stopped it, they looked the other way. Those who questioned were silenced, their voices swallowed up by the power of the institution. Those children, Samuel, they were forgotten by everyone except the walls. The guilt that had already begun to seep into Samuel's mind grew unbearable. He had only uncovered a fraction of the nightmare, and yet it already felt as though the weight of the entire orphanage pressed against his chest. He had come seeking answers, but instead he had been given fragments of a story that shattered the very foundations of everything he thought he knew. The doctor's office, the purifications, the children marked and erased. It was more than he could process in a single moment. But Eliza's final words lingered in his mind, echoing like the softest whisper from the past. They were never meant to be seen again. The truth of the orphanage and the darkness that festered within its walls was only just beginning to surface, and Samuel realized with a shudder that it would take far more than he had anticipated to bring it all into the light. Samuel had spent countless nights haunted by the images in his mind, the crossed-out eyes of the children in the photograph, Eliza's trembling hands as she described the horrors of the doctor's office. But it wasn't until he stood before the orphanage's long-abandoned medical wing that the full extent of the nightmare began to take shape. The building had been closed off for years, its heavy wooden door locked with a rusted padlock that had been neglected over time. It was an oddity Samuel had noticed during his earlier visits, the stark contrast of a seemingly unused wing within the ever-bustling orphanage. But now, with Eliza's words fresh in his mind, he felt a compulsive pull to investigate, to uncover what had been hidden behind that door for so long. When the lock finally gave way, the door creaked open with an eerie groan, and the smell of stale air and decay rushed out to greet him. The room was suffocating in its silence, as if the air itself had been holding its breath for years. Samuel's footsteps echoed in the darkness as he crossed the threshold, his senses on high alert. The walls were lined with shelves, each stacked with jars containing dried herbs and vials of strange liquids. But it was the center of the room that caught his attention. The long wooden table, stained dark with age, surrounded by an array of horrifying instruments. Samuel's stomach churned as he took in the sight. There were restraints, thick leather straps attached to the arms and legs of the table, designed to hold someone in place, but they were far from the only tools that troubled him. There were syringes, some cracked with age, their metal tips rusted but still menacing. Nearby, a row of glass jars sat filled with a clear liquid that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, their contents unidentifiable but ominous. But it was the contraption in the corner of the room that made Samuel's blood run cold. It stood on three long, spindly legs with a large metal coil twisted at the top. A thick wire stretched from it, connected to what looked like a chair that had been bolted to the floor. Beside the chair sat a small table littered with small jars of herbs, some still half-filled, their dried contents long decayed. Samuel felt a rising nausea as he approached the device. There was something disturbingly clinical about it, as though it had been crafted for a specific horrific purpose. At first he thought it might be some sort of medical equipment, but as he examined it more closely, he saw the small inscriptions scratched into the metal. Words in Latin, phrases like purificatio and mundare, that sent a shiver down his spine. And then, as his eyes moved lower, he saw it, a small, faded label barely visible. The purifier. The reality of what he was looking at struck him like a physical blow. The purifier wasn't a medical device, it was an instrument of torture. The metal coil was a crude electroshock device, and the table was designed to restrain the children as they were subjected to brutal electrical treatments. The jars of herbs, some still partially intact, were likely used to prepare the children for the cleansing process. The electricity paired with the herbal concoctions was meant to force the body to purge its impurities. It was nothing short of madness, a barbaric form of control disguised as treatment. Samuel staggered back, his hand clutching the doorframe for support as the weight of what he had discovered pressed down on him. He could almost hear the echoes of the children's screams, the unbearable suffering they had endured in the name of some twisted, self-righteous idea of salvation. The orphanage had been a place of death in more ways than one. The children were not just the victims of neglect and disease. They had been subjected to the hands of a madman. The so-called doctor, whoever he was, had been more than a healer. He had been a torturer using the guise of purification to inflict horrors upon children too vulnerable to resist. Samuel's revulsion grew with every second, his breath shallow as he stumbled backward, unable to tear his eyes from the device that had been used to erase humanity from so many innocent lives. The truth of the orphanage's care, its twisted, ritualistic abuse, was now laid bare before him. There was no redemption in these actions, no excuse, and as Samuel turned and fled from the room, he realized the depths of the evil he had uncovered. The orphanage's walls weren't just hiding the bodies of the dead. They had been hiding the horrors that had been inflicted on the living. And Samuel now knew that no matter how hard he searched, no matter how much he uncovered, the true scale of the darkness would always be too vast to comprehend. Samuel's search for the truth led him down darkened paths, but it wasn't until he met Rachel that the full scale of the horror began to take shape. Rachel had been a child at the orphanage, a quiet girl with a fragile frame, her face now worn by time and pain. She had been one of the few who survived the so-called treatments, though the memories she carried were like jagged fragments of a broken puzzle. Samuel found her living in a small, modest house on the outskirts of town, the windows shuttered tight against the world. When he knocked, she answered slowly, her hands shaking as she opened the door. Her eyes were distant, clouded by the weight of years, but when she saw the photograph Samuel held, the one he had found in the orphanage archives, something shifted in her expression. She invited him inside, though her movements were hesitant, as though every step carried the burden of a forgotten past. They sat in her cramped living room, the silence between them thick and suffocating, until Samuel spoke. "I need to know what happened, Rachel. What happened to the children, to you?" Her eyes flickered to the photograph again and then to the floor. For a long while, she didn't speak, as if the words were too painful to form. Finally, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were just children. We didn't know what was happening until it was too late. They came for us one by one, the ones who didn't fit in, the ones who weren't good enough." Her hands twisted in her lap as she spoke, her breath shallow. "Father Gregory called it cleaning. He said it was for our own good. He said we were broken, impure, that we needed to be made clean again." Rachel's voice broke, and Samuel leaned in, urging her to continue. She closed her eyes, struggling to hold back the flood of memories. "They took us to the doctor's office. No one ever came back the same after that. Those who went in didn't come out the same. Some didn't come out at all." Her eyes welled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. "They told us we were sick. They said we had to be purified. But I remember the screams." Samuel's stomach turned as he listened. The doctor's office, the place where the children had been subjected to the terrible treatments, had not only been a place of pain but of death. "Where did the bodies go, Rachel?" Samuel asked, his voice tight. "The ones who didn't make it?" Rachel shuddered. "They weren't buried with the others, no headstones, no funerals. They were taken somewhere else, I don't know where. But they never came back. And the others, we were told to forget about them, to just move on." She paused, her face hollow, haunted. "The worst part is that no one cared. No one ever asked why they disappeared. No one ever asked why we were being treated this way. There were people in the town who knew, people in power. They made sure no one ever found out. The mayor, the town council, they all turned a blind eye. The weight of her words settled over Samuel like a suffocating blanket. The system that had allowed these atrocities to take place was far deeper than he had imagined. The orphanage wasn't just a place of abuse. It was a machine of systematic destruction, silently aided by those in positions of authority, those who had the power to protect the children but instead chose to bury the truth. Rachel's voice was barely audible now, her eyes distant as she spoke. They made sure the orphanage stayed hidden. They made sure nothing ever came to light. As long as the money kept coming, as long as the town stayed quiet, no one cared what happened behind those walls. A cold shiver ran down Samuel's spine as he realized the scale of the conspiracy. This wasn't just a rogue institution, it was a well-oiled machine sustained by power, wealth, and corruption. As Samuel left Rachel's house, the weight of her confession pressed heavily on him. He had come searching for answers, but now those answers had revealed a darkness far beyond what he had ever imagined. The town, the orphanage, the doctor, and the twisted rituals they had performed, it was all a part of something far larger, a sickness that had infected the very core of the community. And worse still, it was protected by those who should have been its guardians. Samuel walked away from Rachel's house, the night swallowing him whole, and for the first time he felt utterly alone in his quest for truth. The invisible hands that had shaped the orphanage's horrors were far more powerful than he could ever have anticipated. And now, with this knowledge, Samuel was left to wonder, would anyone believe him? Would anyone care? The walls of St. Augustine had been built on silence, and it seemed that no one, not the authorities, not the town, not the people in power, would let the truth see the light of day. Samuel's mind had been spinning for days, unable to reconcile the horrors he had uncovered. The whispers from Eliza, the symbols on the walls, the confessions from Rachel. All of it had painted a picture of suffering beyond measure. But even with the truth slowly unfurling in front of him, something had gnawed at Samuel, something he couldn't put into words. It wasn't just the orphanage, it wasn't just the deaths or the disappearances. It was the pervasive sense that something far darker was at work, something deeper than anything he had yet to uncover. It was a feeling that led him back to the orphanage, even when his every instinct told him to walk away, to let the dead rest and the town continue pretending. But Samuel couldn't. He had already gone too far. And so he returned, driven by the desire to expose whatever evil still lay beneath the surface. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Samuel had heard rumors of a hidden basement beneath the orphanage, a place where no one had ventured for decades, its entry sealed off and forgotten. It wasn't listed on any map. No door marked its entrance. But there were hints. Small whispers from those who still remembered the institution's earlier years before the deaths began to escalate. As he searched, Samuel found it, a loose brick in the back corner of the kitchen, barely noticeable but enough to shift the thick stone into place. With a shove, the wall cracked open, revealing a steep staircase leading into darkness. The air below was thick, damp with the scent of mildew, and the faintest trace of something foul lingered in the stillness. Samuel descended, his hand clutching the rail as if it could steady the growing unease in his chest. When his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he was struck by the cold, unsettling quiet of the space. The basement was far larger than he had expected, and as he looked around, he saw the signs of something unspeakable. Shackles hung from rusted chains in the corners of the room, long abandoned but still chilling in their presence. On the far wall, partially obscured by shadow, was a circle, not just a marking on the floor, but a ritualistic circle drawn in dark, dried stains. And it was the drawings that nearly broke Samuel's resolve. All over the walls were children's drawings, crude sketches that had been made by desperate hands. They showed figures, children all trapped, bound, and staring in horror at things beyond their reach. There were twisted faces, tears, and shapes Samuel couldn't even begin to understand. But the worst of it were the eyes that had been crossed out just like the ones in the photograph. Eyes that screamed of pain and terror. Samuel felt his breath hitch in his chest as he realized the full scope of what had happened in this room. The children, they weren't just victims of neglect or disease. They had been subjected to something far worse. Father Gregory's so-called treatments were more than just medical experiments. They were ritualistic tortures performed in the name of purification. He hadn't been trying to help them. He had been destroying them. They weren't just being healed from their flaws. They were being broken, disfigured, their spirits crushed in the name of some twisted belief in salvation. The circle, the shackles, the drawings, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. Father Gregory had used these children as experiments, subjecting them to pain and terror, convinced that by ridding them of their flaws, he was somehow saving their souls. The idea that he could cleanse them through suffering had turned into an obsession, a madness that stretched far beyond anything Samuel had ever encountered. And as the weight of this realization settled over him, Samuel heard it. A faint sound, a whisper of something moving in the darkness. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest as the air grew colder. The sounds grew louder, and for the first time Samuel felt a chill that wasn't just from the dampness of the basement. It was something else, something alive. A soft, breathless whisper echoed through the room, followed by the faintest echo of a child's cry. It was distant but unmistakable. The cries of the children, the ones who had been silenced. Their spirits were not at rest. They had been lost in this place, their lives stolen, their memories buried under layers of guilt and shame. The atmosphere in the basement thickened with a palpable tension, and Samuel realized that it wasn't just the memories that haunted these walls. It was the presence of those who had suffered. Their pain had seeped into the very foundation of the orphanage. Their spirits were restless, trapped in a world they could not escape. And now, as Samuel stood in the heart of their torment, their cries began to echo, growing louder, sharper, until they seemed to surround him. He couldn't stay in this room any longer. Samuel's legs shook as he turned and fled, the voices growing louder behind him, urging him to remember. As he ascended the stairs, the weight of what he had uncovered pressed on him like a physical force. The orphanage was a tomb, and the children were its ghosts, unable to move on, their suffering too great to be forgotten. Outside, the daylight felt foreign, the air too bright, too clean. But as Samuel stepped back into the light, one thing was clear. The truth was darker than he had ever imagined. And it would haunt him forever. The orphanage wasn't just a place of evil. It was a place where the souls of the lost children would never find peace. The further Samuel delved into the orphanage's dark secrets, the more certain he became that the true heart of its evil lay hidden somewhere within its walls. He had heard the whispers from Walter Tams. The caretaker had once spoken of a hidden room, a place no one dared enter, even the staff. When Walter had mentioned it, his voice had trembled and his eyes had shifted nervously, as though the room itself might come alive at the mention of its name. It was this room Samuel now sought, convinced that it held the final pieces of the puzzle he had been slowly piecing together. The door was hidden behind a false panel in the orphanage's main office, where Father Gregory used to oversee the daily operations. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary wall, but Samuel, following his instincts, ran his hands along the wooden surface until he found the subtle indentation. With a quiet creak, the panel slid open, revealing a narrow passage leading into darkness. His heart pounded as he stepped inside, a sense of foreboding curling around him like smoke. The air was thick with dust and the scent of old, forgotten things. The room was small, cramped and windowless, yet it felt like the walls were closing in on him as he scanned the space. But it was the large wooden desk in the center of the room that drew his attention first. Papers were scattered across its surface. Stacks of records, each page meticulously handwritten, all chronicling something that made Samuel's stomach churn. He began to read, each line more horrifying than the last. These were not just administrative logs, they were detailed accounts of the children who had died in the orphanage. Every death, every name was accounted for, and with disturbing precision the cause of death was listed as purification or cleansing. The further Samuel read, the deeper the horror sank into his bones. He flipped through the records, his hands shaking as he scanned each entry. Names he recognized, children he had seen in photographs or heard about from the few survivors. Children whose lives had been cut short under the guise of salvation. But the true sickening revelation came when Samuel noticed a pattern. The children who had died were not random. They were selected. Father Gregory had chosen them based on specific traits, qualities he deemed unworthy or impure. Some were described as unruly, defiant, or too curious, traits that, in Gregory's twisted worldview, made them targets for his so-called purification process. It wasn't just about illness or sickness, it was about control. And the children who didn't fit his vision of purity were disposed of, their deaths marked as something sacred, something righteous. But in truth, it was nothing more than brutal murder, cloaked in religious zealotry. Samuel's breath came in ragged gasps as he read the descriptions. The suffering these children endured, the terrible treatments that were forced upon them. Each page seemed to draw him further into the nightmare, each entry sinking him deeper into a pit of despair. The records revealed the depth of Father Gregory's madness, his belief that he was performing divine work, saving the children by breaking them. It was as though the very life had been drained from these children, their bodies and souls torn apart in the name of a twisted salvation. The weight of it all nearly crushed Samuel. He staggered back from the desk, his head spinning as the weight of the truth pressed down on him. The orphanage hadn't just been a place of suffering. It had been a breeding ground for a man's delusions, a sanctuary for his cruelty. Father Gregory wasn't just a misguided priest, he was a predator, using the orphanage as his personal dominion over life and death. And the children, they had been nothing more than pawns in his warped game. As Samuel turned away from the desk, the walls seemed to close in on him. The voices of the dead children, their cries, their pleas, they seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Samuel couldn't escape them. They had been calling to him since he first stepped foot in the orphanage, and now, with the weight of the truth finally laid bare before him, their voices grew louder, more insistent. They were angry, desperate, and their pain seeped through the very air around him. Samuel knew that he had uncovered the full extent of the darkness that had taken root within St. Augustine. The hidden room with its carefully catalogued horrors had revealed the true face of the institution's evil. But the sadness that lingered within him now was unlike anything he had ever known. The voices of the children, the innocence lost, the twisted hands that had created this nightmare. It all coiled inside him, too much to bear. He had come seeking justice, but the truth, the full truth, was a weight he didn't know if he could carry. The orphanage had been a place of death, and its shadows would haunt him for the rest of his life. The children, their spirits crying out for justice, would never be at peace. Neither would he. The town council meeting room was filled with the murmur of quiet voices as Samuel entered, his briefcase heavy with the documents he had gathered over the past months. It was a strange sort of calm that hung in the air, as though the council members had already decided that no matter what Samuel presented, they would not be moved. He had come to them with the truth, the undeniable evidence of the orphanage's atrocities, the records, the confessions, and the damning discoveries beneath the walls. But as he stood before the council, he felt a deep unease settle in his chest. Something in the air was wrong, as if the very room was closing in on him, shutting him out from any possibility of justice. Samuel cleared his throat and placed the stack of papers on the table, his hands trembling. "What you're about to hear," he began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion inside him, "is the truth about St. Augustine Orphanage. It is not a place of care. It has never been. It has been a place of abuse, suffering, and murder, concealed under the guise of charity and religious devotion." He recounted the horrors, the children chosen for their flaws, the experiments conducted in the name of purification, and the silent, systematic killings masked as treatments. He spoke of the hidden room, the rituals, and the extensive cover-up orchestrated by Father Gregory and supported by the highest figures in the town, people who had benefited from the orphanage's operations. He laid it all out, piece by piece, the weight of the evidence overwhelming. But as he finished speaking, a quiet, unsettling silence descended upon the room. The council members exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. They were not shocked. They were not moved. Instead, they sat like statues, the very air around them growing colder with each passing second. It wasn't disbelief that held them back. It was complicity. Samuel could see it in their eyes. They had known, or at the very least suspected, the horrors of the orphanage. But they had chosen to look the other way, to protect the institution and the power that came with it. After what felt like an eternity, Mayor Thompson, the town's leader and one of the most influential men in the room, finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as though this were nothing more than a routine matter. "We understand your concerns, Mr. Thompson," he said, glancing at the documents Samuel had presented. "And we appreciate the effort you've put into bringing these matters to light. However, the orphanage has been a part of this town for many years. It has helped countless children, and there are many who believe in the good it has done." The mayor paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "As for the allegations you've raised, we will look into them, of course. But understand this. The town cannot afford to let go of an institution like the orphanage. It has supported our community, our economy. There are too many powerful figures involved, too many lives at stake. This is not something we can disrupt lightly." Samuel's heart sank as he heard the words, each one a reaffirmation of the town's priorities. Justice, truth, and the lives of those children didn't matter. What mattered was the status quo, the system of power that had allowed these horrors to continue unchecked. They had no intention of holding anyone accountable. Not Father Gregory, not the town council, not the people who had looked away while children were broken and lost. The mayor's words were a final blow. The town council, after a few more dismissive murmurs, adjourned the meeting with little more than a vague promise to investigate the matter. It was the same hollow response Samuel had feared. No action, no justice. Just a promise to maintain silence, to bury the truth deeper, where no one would dare disturb it. Later that evening, a small memorial was quietly erected outside the orphanage, a modest stone plaque that read, "In memory of the children lost." It was the town's official acknowledgement of the deaths, but it was empty. There were no names, no real recognition of the horror. The story was buried, left in the dark, with only Samuel to remember the truth. As he walked back through the streets of the town, the weight of his failure pressed down on him. He had fought for the children, for the truth. But the system, The powerful forces that controlled this place had swallowed it all whole. He realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that nothing would change. Not here. Not now. The orphanage's legacy would remain untouched, its horrors buried beneath the town's false sense of progress. And Samuel, left with the knowledge of the truth, could only carry it alone. The voices of the dead children, their cries for justice, would echo in his mind forever. But the world, it seemed, had decided to move on, leaving them all to fade into forgotten history. The confession came as a shock, but not in the way Samuel had hoped. It was not the public outcry he had envisioned, not the justice he had fought for, nor the reckoning the children deserved. Instead, Father Gregory's confession arrived in the most unexpected of ways. Framed as a moment of self-righteous penance, a pathetic attempt to reconcile with a guilt he had carried for far too long. It happened one late afternoon when Samuel received an invitation to meet Father Gregory. The priest had asked to speak with him privately, to clear the air, as he put it. Samuel hesitated, but his instinct told him this could be the final piece of the puzzle. He arrived at the orphanage to find the old priest waiting in the same darkened office, the one where he had orchestrated so many of his terrible deeds. The room was eerily quiet, the air thick with the weight of unspoken years. Father Gregory was seated behind his desk, his hands folded in front of him. His face, once firm and authoritative, was now hollowed and weary, as though the years of guilt had taken their toll. When he spoke, his voice was low, but there was no hiding the tremor in it. "I've lived with this long enough, Samuel," he began, his eyes downcast. "It's time the truth came out." For a moment, Samuel thought perhaps the old man had come to face his crimes, to offer an apology. But what followed was not an admission of evil. It was a twisted justification, framed as an act of penance. "I believed I was saving them," Gregory continued, his voice strained. "The children, the ones who died, they were broken, you see. Flawed, society rejects. The orphans, the vulnerable, the lost. They were never meant to be part of this world. I did what was necessary to purify them, to cleanse them of their imperfections, to return them to God." He paused as if his words held the weight of some divine revelation. "In the end, I thought I was doing his work, saving their souls from a fate worse than death." The coldness in his eyes sent a shiver down Samuel's spine. Here, in this moment, Gregory was not a broken man confessing to unspeakable acts. He was still trying to justify them, to frame himself as some twisted savior in his own narrative. Samuel's heart sank as the horror of the situation became clear. This confession, this admission, was not an apology. It was the ramblings of a man who saw himself as above reproach, a man who had never truly understood the destruction he had caused. The lives of the children had never mattered to him. They had been nothing but pawns in his delusional attempt to create a perfect world, one that reflected his own warped vision of purity. "There were no flaws in them," Samuel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was you, Gregory, you who were broken." Gregory looked up, a shadow of something unreadable passing across his face. "Perhaps. But the world didn't want them, Samuel. I gave them a purpose. I gave them meaning. But the truth, the horrifying, undeniable truth, was already laid bare. Samuel had known it all along. The orphanage, the suffering, the deaths had been nothing more than a tool of control, a breeding ground for Gregory's twisted ideals. As Father Gregory's confession hung in the air, it became clear that it had come too late. The town, its people had already moved on, too busy with their own lives to acknowledge the atrocities committed in the name of salvation. The church would defend him, the town would turn a blind eye, and the deaths of those children would remain unanswered, left to haunt the shadows of the orphanage forever. Samuel left the office that day with nothing but a heavy heart and a bitter realization. His efforts, the truth he had uncovered, would never bring justice. The system was too entrenched, too powerful to be shaken by one man's voice. The deaths of the children, the suffering they had endured, would remain buried, their cries fading into the silence of a town too willing to forget. As he walked away from the orphanage for the last time, Samuel felt the weight of a tragic resignation settle over him. No one would be held accountable. The truth, for all its horror, was not enough to change the world. And the children would never be at peace. Years passed after the orphanage was shut down, and life in the town returned to a strange, peaceful rhythm, as if the past had never happened. The town moved on. The people went about their lives, the children grew up, and the once dreaded orphanage was torn down, replaced with new buildings that stood as symbols of progress. The memory of what had transpired behind its walls began to fade, gradually losing its grip on the collective conscience. A small plaque was erected near the site, a simple stone memorial that read, "In memory of the lost children of St. Augustine." It was a quiet, almost hollow gesture, a feeble attempt to acknowledge the tragedy. But the true story, the full depth of the suffering remained buried. The plaque, with its vague, impersonal wording, did nothing to honor the victims. It was a convenient reminder for the town, one that allowed them to pretend the horrors had never occurred, that they could erase the past and move forward without the weight of guilt. Samuel watched all of this unfold from the sidelines, a silent observer to the town's willful amnesia. He had tried to do what was right. He had fought for the truth, for justice. But the world, it seemed, was content to ignore it. The laws had changed, slowly and with great reluctance, responding to the public outcry, but the real changes, the ones that would ensure something like St. Augustine would never happen again, were never made. The system, the corrupt machinery that had allowed the orphanage to exist for so long, remained intact. The powers that had hidden the truth were still in place, their influence undisturbed. The deeper Samuel looked, the more he realized that the evil he had uncovered was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger systemic rot. It thrived in silence, in the quiet corners of society where power went unchallenged and where vulnerable lives were discarded in the name of charity. It wore the mask of benevolence, and in doing so, it was protected. Injustice, Samuel came to understand, often doesn't need to be actively defended. It simply needs to be ignored, forgotten. The world moves on, and those who suffer are erased from memory, their pain turned into something easily dismissed. It wasn't just the orphanage, he realized. It was every institution, every system that allowed cruelty to flourish in the shadows, protected by the very structures that were supposed to safeguard the innocent. The silence was deafening, and Samuel, with all his knowledge, was left alone to carry it. The faces of the children haunted him still. Their eyes, the ones crossed out in ink, the ones that had begged for mercy, forever imprinted in his mind. But he knew that the town had moved on. They had chosen to forget, to bury the past, and in doing so, they had buried the truth. And so the evil continued, thriving in the silence, its roots spreading deeper into the foundations of the town. Samuel, now older, watched as life went on, and he was left with the chilling truth. Some evils are not defeated. They are simply allowed to grow, quietly, under the guise of normalcy until they are forgotten by all but those who have seen the darkness firsthand. The weight of that silence was the heaviest burden Samuel had ever known, and it was one he would carry for the rest of his life. Decades passed, and the town of St. Augustine grew more prosperous with each year. The roads were paved, businesses flourished, and the old scars of the past were paved over with fresh paint. The orphanage, once the center of so many dark memories, was long forgotten, its crumbling foundation replaced with a new housing development. The plaque, with its cold, impersonal words, remained as the only reminder of what had once been. But even that was neglected, covered in ivy, weathered by time. The town had moved on, just as it always had. But for Samuel, now an older man, the past was never truly gone. He walked through the town's bustling streets, seeing the faces of the children who had grown up, living lives free of the horrors their parents had ignored. The new generation was unaware of the orphanage's legacy, and the shadow of the past seemed further and further away. Yet deep within Samuel's heart, a gnawing dread lingered. The legacy of those deaths, of the children whose lives were stolen, whose cries were silenced, had never truly faded. It haunted him, and he knew that it haunted the town in its subconscious, in the corners of the collective memory that no one dared touch. Samuel couldn't help but wonder, could this happen again? The orphanage had been a part of the town's foundation, an institution that had survived despite its evil, despite its brokenness. It had flourished in the silence of a system that protected it. What had happened to the children, those lost souls, could easily happen again, buried beneath the surface of what appeared to be progress. As Samuel looked at the new buildings, the smiling families, the children playing in the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that the system that had allowed the orphanage's atrocities to continue, the same system that turned a blind eye to suffering and protected those in power, was still in place, waiting to swallow the next generation of vulnerable children. The truth of St. Augustine's legacy had been buried, but the mechanisms of cruelty had not disappeared. He stood in front of the empty room in the abandoned building where the orphanage had once stood. The windows were boarded up, the walls silent. It was a room that held nothing, yet everything. And as Samuel stood there, he could almost hear them. The whispers of the children who had once been lost, their spirits lingering in the shadows, waiting to be remembered. The last image that stayed with Samuel, the one that would never leave him, was that empty room. It was a haunting reminder that evil had not been destroyed. It had only been forgotten. And so the question remained, could this happen again? Could the silence be broken? Or would it all repeat, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to look, to remember? The question hung in the air unanswered as the town moved on, and Samuel, left with the weight of a truth no one else would face, was left to carry it alone.